For regular videos on ancient cultures and forgotten civilizations, please subscribe.
This is an area where there has been a narrative that archaeology has sought to impose upon us. And this was called the Clovis First idea, that there was a people who archaeologists called the Clovis people. We don't know what they called themselves, in North America. And traces of their characteristic tools, particular sort of fluted points, arrowheads, spear points, turn up from about 13,400 years ago and end abruptly 12,800 years ago. And for a long time, with the beginning of the Younger Dryas, and for a long time, archaeology maintained that this Clovis culture, so-called Clovis culture, we don't know what they called themselves, were the first Americans, and that there were no human beings in the Americas before 13,400 years ago. And bit by bit, the new evidence has come in which has forced archaeologists screaming and tearing out their hair to back away from the Clovis First paradigm and admit that actually, yes, there were people here before that. But even then, they're reluctant to go very far back. We've recently had these footprints in White Sands in New Mexico, 23,000 years old or so. That's largely being accepted now. But there are much earlier dates. There's 130,000 years ago from the Cerruti Mastodon site near San Diego.
Okay, so here's a narrative that Hancock has repeated many times. It's his go-to example of a case where, wait for it, archaeologists changed their minds as new evidence was found. Most people think that's a good thing. The reason why Hancock likes to use it, however, is because he himself has been trying to push the idea that humans were in America earlier, and then archaeologists later ended up accepting the idea that humans were in America earlier. So he can spin a story where they refused to believe what he had been saying, and they had to be dragged kicking and screaming towards the truth. They were blinded by their own egos, while his clear perception of the evidence won the day. But that's not what happened. Here is the truth of the matter. Just as in every case, the archaeological consensus of what happened forms around the theory that best explains the existing evidence. In order for a new theory to be adopted, sufficient evidence must be brought in to overturn it. As more evidence is brought in, the scale begins to tip. More and more individual archaeologists become convinced, and when enough of them are, the scale tips in favor of the new theory. Before this happened in the case of humans in America, Hancock was looking for support for his theory about an earlier civilization, and this required humans to be in America earlier, so he looked for whatever evidence he could find, even if it was weak or flimsy, and he marshaled any example that bolstered his theory. He didn't go with the preponderance of evidence. He went with the evidence that suited his narrative. Then later, as evidence was brought in by archaeologists, not by him, and when the preponderance of evidence finally showed that humans were in America earlier, he proclaimed that he had seen this all along. The archaeologists were blind to see what he already knew, and their weakness was their big ego. They should show humility like he did. The lesson to learn from all of this, of course, is that we have to allow the evidence, not our own theories, to lead us. Notice how he still thinks their current view isn't good enough, and he wants to push the date of human arrival in America back even earlier. So he cites the Cerruti Mastodon evidence, which is a weak example. And if you want to know why, I know a couple of channels that explain it well, so I'll leave links to them below. In order to demonstrate that what he is saying about the archaeological establishment is true, Hancock not only claims that he personally is persecuted by it, he claims it has destroyed the careers of good archaeologists. His favorite instance to cite to support this claim is that of Jacques Cinq-Mars, which is related to the Clovis First argument he was just talking about.
The Americas have been misrepresented for a very long time by archaeology. And archaeologists will be annoyed with me for saying that. They have a way of forgetting their own errors, of saying, oh, well, we knew that all along. It wasn't the case. But the fact of the matter remains that for best part of 50 years, from the 1960s through until about 2010, American archaeology was locked in a dogma that they actually had a name for, which was Clovis First. That they invented a name for a culture. They called them the Clovis culture. We don't know what they called themselves. They were hunter-gatherers. They first appear in the archaeological record 400 years ago, and they vanished from the archaeological record 12,600 years ago. And for a very long time, it was maintained adamantly that these were the first Americans, that no human being touched the soil of the Americas until 13,400 years ago. Just animals, but no human beings present at all. And any archaeologist who attempted to dispute that dogma, and I use the word deliberately, there should be no room for dogma in science, but any archaeologist who challenged that would face severe problems with his or her career. They would be mocked and humiliated at conferences, like an archaeologist called Jacques Cinq-Mars from Canada, who excavated in the Yukon. Humiliated at conferences, insulted, accused of making stuff up. Their research funding would be withdrawn. Basically, to challenge Clovis First was the end of your archaeological career. So naturally, very few archaeologists wanted to challenge Clovis First.
Hancock is getting his information largely from an article written in 2017 by archaeologist Heather Pringle for Hancocks magazine, and reprinted the next day in Smithsonian magazine, about how Cinq-Mars' work conducted between 1979 and 2001 was finally vindicated. She refers to fierce opposition to Cinq-Mars' conclusions and bitter debate. She says Cinq-Mars likened it to the Spanish Inquisition. She writes about attending conferences in which Cinq-Mars presented his conclusions. Quote, often a polite bemusement spread throughout the room, as if the audience was dealing with some crackpot uncle, or the atmosphere grew testy and tense as someone began grilling the presenter. But once or twice, the mask of professional respect slipped completely. I heard laughter and snickering in the room. She quotes Tom Dillehay as saying the scientific atmosphere was clearly toxic and clearly impeded science. There is clear criticism here made by archaeologists about the behavior of other archaeologists, and I do hope this will prove to be a learning experience that will spur archaeologists to make some changes in their personal behavior towards those they disagree with. But Hancock puts a personal spin on this. To tie it in with his thesis about archaeology being a religion, he speaks of dogma. He makes the claim that to challenge Clovis First was the end of your archaeological career, which Pringle never says.
Jacques Cinq-Mars, the excavator of the Bluefish Caves in the Yukon, back in the 1970s was proposing that human beings had been in the Americas at least 24,000 years ago. His reputation was utterly destroyed. His research funding was withdrawn. He was given no access to grants. He wasn't able to do his work. He was heavily penalized and punished by the community. And now, just a few weeks ago, we have the Smithsonian coming out and saying, sorry, we got it wrong. Jacques Cinq-Mars was right all along.
Let's look at Cinq-Mars' career. He started fieldwork at Bluefish Caves in 1977. In 1979, he published one of the first peer-reviewed journal articles on a purported pre-Clovis site. He was hired into a permanent position at the Canadian Museum of Civilization the same year as head of the Rescue Archaeology Program and curator of Boreal Forest Archaeology. Cinq-Mars' work at the Bluefish Caves was funded from 1977 until 1987. If there was an effort to destroy his career by taking away the funding, they sure took their time doing it. 10 years of funded research at the same site? It's a long run. Now, it's true that Pringle says funding for his bluefish work grew scarce, his field work eventually sputtered and died. Well, this is because the museum, which was his only source of funding, stopped funding him after 10 years. This is not the same as saying he was given no access to grants, and he remained in his position at the museum until he retired in 2002. And he continued working on other pre-Clovis research and many other archaeological projects up until he retired. He did get some harsh criticism by a handful of people, and he complained about it, but his findings were controversial. When excavating sites that old, there is always an issue of getting reliable dates from secure cultural layers. Later work yielded new data and secured dates that better supported Cinq-Mars' conclusions. The misbehavior of some archaeologists was in how they treated him at conferences, and I will agree that even if careers are not destroyed, laughing at people at conferences is unacceptable. But I don't think criticism is anything to get upset about. It comes with the territory. When an idea is controversial, expect controversy. I don't have a problem with anyone disagreeing with a fellow archaeologist about something, and you shouldn't either. Every historian and archaeologist knows that their work will be subject to scrutiny. It must pass the test of fire. Bottom line, Cinq-Mars had a long career. He never lost his job. He continued to do archaeology. He continued to publish. His reputation was not utterly destroyed. His work was vindicated during his lifetime. This is not a case where archaeologists destroyed the career of another archaeologist simply for disagreeing with the consensus. I think you would be hard-pressed to find one. But even if you could, pointing out isolated abuses does not demonstrate that the field of archaeology is abusive and corrupt. Ponder why Graham Hancock tells this story over and over again with his own characteristic spin. Is it because he wants people to see him as a Cinq-Mars type personality who will one day be vindicated? Is the criticism of his ideas like the criticism that Cinq-Mars received? They laughed at him, they laughed at Hancock. And just as Cinq-Mars won in the end, maybe Hancock will also. Or it could just be to continue this narrative of archaeology being corrupt.
But my point about this is that what it meant was, since it was the dogma that Clovis was first, that the oldest dates were 13,400 years ago, there seemed to be no logic to archaeologists in digging deeper. You know how it is with archaeology, that the upper levels are the youngest, and the deeper you go, the older it gets. And the feeling was, no need to dig below the Clovis layer, because we already know that there were no human beings there before that.
This is an oversimplification. Most pre-Clovis sites have been found in the normal course of excavation. You don't have to be specifically looking for it to find it. Though I'm sure if you go out of your way to look for it, you will be more likely to find it. But the point is that it was inevitable that pre-Clovis sites would be found. Nevertheless, it is true that archaeologists may have found more had they been looking. Well, they will find more now. Is there a reason why they should be in a big hurry? No, really. Is there some urgency here that we should be aware of?